All right, guys, let's talk for just a second about this Craftsman table saw. I picked this up off of Craigslist and I paid all of $60 for a working table saw, which is fantastic. I can't believe the junk that people want $200 for on Craigslist. But it is not without its charms, so to speak. This table saw is sort of in the middle in terms of the years of table saws, if you will, which in some ways makes it the worst of both worlds. It's not old enough to be built like a tank and be totally cast iron and a giant motor and all that fun, happy stuff. But it's also not new enough to have the amenities of a modern table saw. It does not have a riving knife. It does not have a blade guard that is worth anything. It does not have a fence that is real reliable that you can count on. And our project for today, it has stamped steel wings, which are okay at best, frankly. They're not flat. They have these ridges right here. I don't know if you can see them on the camera. There's 5 of them, 1 on each edge, 3 in the middle. These are the only thing that's level with the cast iron top of the center of the table saw. They're only level if you fool with it a lot. On this far side over here that you can't see real well, I have this thing kind of jacked up as far as it'll go on the far end, and it still slopes down just a little bit. So that's what motivated me to look at ripping these things out and replacing them with something else. I do have the option of going with steel, but quite frankly, that would be expensive and unnecessary. There's no need for that kind of strength of material. So wood it is, but I opted for melamine, because I want a nice slippery surface on the top of this, and I want something that is fairly durable. I'm going to be sliding wood across it, obviously, as I cut parts on the table saw. I use this as a sort of an auxiliary work table all the time. So I want something fairly slippery and yet fairly durable, and I don't want to spend a fortune on it. Melamine is the perfect sort of combination of those 3 things. So before I can put any melamine in here, I have to take these stamped steel wings off. But I don't want to do it quite yet because my melamine is still in half sheets from the big box store. And I want to cut it down at least to something close to what's going to fit in here. And I need the table space in order to deal with a sheet that size. All right, so what I've done here is I've taken a piece of the aluminum bar stock that's going to ultimately be the side supports for these table wings. And I have clamped it to the left side of the blade, and I've made sure that I've clamped it up against the teeth. So I have a line here which is exactly straight on to that edge of the blade. That gives me something I can reliably line up my pencil line where I want to cut this sheet with, get the sheet nice and square. I have an extra support under the front end of this thing here, and then just put the fence wherever it ends up. That works no matter what the curve of your blade is or normally how far things are from the blade to the fence. Now that my melamine is roughed out to a reasonable size, I don't need the full space on the tabletop here, so I can go ahead and take these wings off. They're held on with a series of 12mm bolts and nuts. There are 4 of them that connect the long edge directly to the cast iron top of the saw, and there are 2 on each end that have a square head slides into this track on the aluminum rail that is the fence so that the bolts can't spin when you're tightening the nuts down. Once the 4 on the long edge are removed, you only have to loosen the ones on the ends. The whole thing will just slide right out. So it's easy enough getting these things off. Now we can turn our attention to the melamine that's going to replace it. The very first thing that you'll notice is right here. This is thick. This is not. The sort of obvious solution is to just double up on the melamine or back it with another sheet of some other kind of plywood to bring it up to this thickness. The problem is that doesn't leave you any access to the bolt holes. These things right here, we need available to put the bolts through the edge of our table wing and into the rails, and likewise on the long edge to get them connected to the table saw top. So this thing can't just be a solid block that's this thick. I mean, unless your table saw allows you good access, from the back side. If you have maybe a Bessemer style fence where you have a piece of angle iron that you can get through, then you can get away with that just attached directly into here. But on this kind of a saw, we're going to need this sort of a lip type of arrangement in order to get the holes that we need to attach it. That's what these are for. This is 2-inch by 1/8 inch aluminum bar stock. So here's the master plan. I'm going to cut this bar stock to fit the sides and the one long edge of this melamine. I'll drill and countersink a whole bunch of holes in here so that I can screw the aluminum bar to the melamine. So then this aluminum creates essentially the lip that matches the stamped steel wings where I can drill the mounting holes to connect to the saw. All right, let me show you, there is one problem with this theory. If I use the aluminum bar just as a straight edge to go across, so we're up the thickness of the melamine, you'll notice that I'm sort of running into the holes here. What happens is the holes are basically 3/4 of an inch down from the top of this plate. So even though I've got these things to use as edges, I'm still going to have to drill something that looks like maybe half of a pocket hole in the edges and along the sides and such things of this board in order to have enough access to get the nuts in there and the washers and twist them and turn them. First things first, I got to cut this aluminum bar stock down to fit my table wing edges and sides and such things. I'm going to start with the smaller of the two, the one that goes to the left of the blade. I've set my bigger piece back here behind me for no reason other than I'm going to waste less material if I screw this up, so I'm going to do it first. For the long edge of the table wing, I want the aluminum to be exactly the depth of the table saw top. So what I've done is I've just clamped it to the table saw top. I've got it perfectly aligned on the back end back here. If I feel it with my finger, it's exactly even and it's clamped in place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my little Starrett square in here and use it to mark the front of the table saw. Now I can take my other square and slide it up until it hits the first one, and I know that I'm in perfect alignment with the front edge of the table saw. I'm going to make my mark using a knife so I get a nice, thin, exact line. With the table wings off, I can use one of them as a template for the long dimension of the melamine. What I have kind of rigged up here is the two pieces of aluminum bar stock that are going to go on the ends of the melamine. What I need is for melamine plus aluminum to exactly equal the length of the existing wings. In the case of my saw, that happens to be exactly 27 inches, but I still don't want to measure it and cut it. There's just too much chance of being off by a 1/16 or something. And if this isn't exactly the right length, then when you bolt it together, what it's going to do is it's going to bend the rails that make up the fence. So what I did is I used these long clamps to attach the aluminum back here to the melamine, creating the thing that I want to trim to length. I then exactly, just used my fingers, they're amazingly sensitive, lined it up with the old table saw wing on the back and clamped it together nice and tight with this C-clamp. What I'm going to use is a flush trim bit in the router, and I'm going to run the guide bearing along the old table saw wing, and I'm going to just take off material here. The difficulty I have here is that the existing table saw wing is too narrow to use as a template for the entire melamine cut. Also, while I'm relatively confident that this is going to give me the right length, I'm not as confident that it's totally square. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to take the trim router and I'm going to cut just a small section right here in the center. I don't want the bearing to get into these bowl holes or anything like that, so I'm only going to cut out, about an inch or so here in the center. Then I can take this apart. I can use the router bit set flush up against where I want it to cut to set a T-square fence across the melamine this way and use that to make the rest of the cut. That way I'll know it's exactly the right distance in, and I'll know it's perfectly square to the edges. This aluminum piece in the back is the one that I ground to exactly fit between the rails and be the same length as the table saw top. So that is almost as good of a reference as the original wings that I pulled out of it. And sure enough, if I clamp aluminum to either side of the melamine, it all just lines up just spiffy in the back. So I'm very, very confident that I have this dimension at least as close as I can get it. The other thing doing this fit up lets me do is to just mark my stock for the side of this thing. This is not a critical dimension because that's just gonna hang out the end of the rail there. So if it's off by a 16th or something like that, it's not going to affect how the thing mounts, just how it looks. With the aluminum cut to length, I have to move on to the drilling of the various holes that are going to secure the entire finished new wing to the table saw, and then ultimately to secure the aluminum to the melamine. Again, what I want to do is I want to use the old wing as a template for where the holes should go. So I have the aluminum bar clamped along the long edge here where the mounting holes that connect the wing to the table saw top go. This bar clamp up at the top ensures that the aluminum and the table saw wing are flush against both ends. And I have one of these little F-style clamps clamped right next to each one of the mounting holes the whole way down here to ensure that the aluminum is nice and tight up against the old wing. And then finally, the whole thing is smashed down flat on the bench so that I know I have the ridges, which are supposed to be the actual top of the old wing, even flush with the top edge of the aluminum bar. Now, what the heck is all that for? Well, I need to mark the aluminum so that I can take it over to the drill press and drill these holes nice and straight and perpendicular. Now, if you had a transfer punch that was this size, this happens to be a 3/8 inch hole, you could do this with a punch. So plan B is to come in here and hit these holes with a 3/8 inch drill bit in this right angle drill so that I can get in there pretty darn close to straight. That's really all it takes to make a good mark. Okay, it is important both that these holes are in the right place and that they are straight through the aluminum. Straight I'm going to take care of by leaving this aluminum a little bit loose so that the drill bit can self-center in the starter hole that we made using the template. Then once the drill bit has located itself, I'll come in with the wrench and I'll tighten down this clamp so that it can't move. I'm doing my drilling in 2 steps, largely because it's a lot easier to get the smaller bit to automatically find its own center. Now that I have a 3/16 inch hole, coming back and centering the 3/8 inch bit is almost trivial. Okay, holes drilled, got my piece installed for a little test fit, and let me tell you, that is as smooth as the proverbial baby's butt right there. I'm going to use the same technique to mark and drill the holes that go in the aluminum that makes up the ends of the 2 wings with one sort of minor variation. On the long edge, I needed to exactly match the holes that are in the table saw top. So I was able to use this as a precise template. However, on the ends of these wings, for some sort of absurd reason, they put the 2 bolt holes real close together right in the center of it. So I'm essentially using these as a template just for the height or depth, if you want to think of it that way, for the holes, but I'll be moving this thing back and forth manually to get the 2 holes spaced where I want them. Okay, I got all my holes that I need to mount these rails to the saw drilled, and I've had all the pieces up there, and everything lines up great, which is good news. Next round of drilling in the metal is the holes where the screws are going to go that attach the aluminum to the actual melamine. Now, the location of these screws is not critical left and right anyway. They do need to be exactly 3/8 inch down from the top of the aluminum bar to come into the center of the 3/4 inch thick melamine. What I've done is I've just laid out some marks with a square that are all 3/8 of an inch down from the top. I'm going to go around and punch them to make a starting point for the drill bit on the drill press, and then we're going to have to drill it in 3 steps. First part's the good one. It's where you get to beat stuff. Well, guys, classic case of bigger is not always better. I'm using number 6 screws to attach the aluminum to the melamine. 6, 8, either one would work fine. The point is, You don't want to go too big in diameter because you're going to end up without enough melamine to support the weight of pushing down on the wing. Doesn't really matter because none of those screws are big enough to require a drill bit that I can chuck up in the mother of all drill presses over there. I am drilling all of these holes by hand. Long forgotten tool. Remember these drills that plug in? Yeah, they still exist. And this particular one works really nicely because it has a real smooth variable speed trigger on it, and it has a bubble level on the back. So I can put it in place here, I can control the speed easily, and I can make sure that I'm going reasonably straight. A little bit of lubrication goes a long way when drilling these holes by hand. You don't notice it on the drill press because you're just leaning on that little arm, but now you're leaning on your own arm. Okay, YouTube, getting down to some critical bits here. I have all of the 3/32 holes where ultimately one of those number 6 screws is going to go drilled in the aluminum. That then becomes my template for where to drill the pilot holes into the melamine. That's why I drilled 3/32 holes. That's the appropriate straight bit size for a pilot hole in softwood, which particle board is most definitely soft. There's two things that are sort of critical at this point. One is that the aluminum and the melamine are flat together. And that's why I'm over here on the table saw. I have the melamine pressed down flat, I have the aluminum pressed down flat, and I clamped it in place. So if I slide this edge over here and I start feeling, I'm hard pressed unless I use a fingernail to feel where the melamine stops and the aluminum starts. Now the other thing that's critical is, just like I was trying to go straight through this aluminum, I need to go straight into the melamine. I can't afford to have the screw cocked one way or the other. It'll lose strength because the melamine will get thin and it won't sit flush against here, which means it won't mount against the rail properly. So I need to figure out how to go straight into this melamine when the drill bit that I'm using is too small for my drill press. Hey guys, I got taller. It's just out of frame, but I'm standing on a stool because this is what I came up with. I put the melamine with the aluminum clamp to it here in the tail vise of the workbench upright. There's a piece of wood on either side to help sort of elongate and spread out the jaws, but also so that I can shim this piece. You can't see it, it's behind here, but if I break it off, there's a little scrap piece actually stuck in on this side to push the melamine forward so that it is truly vertical. Now, what that lets me do, now that I have an extra foot of height, is come up here with the drill that has the bubble level in the back, line it up dead center, and I know that I am drilling straight down into a piece of wood that is straight up. The other thing to take care of while I'm up here is these holes where the aluminum mounts to the table saw itself. I mentioned before, the 3/4 inch melamine is just exactly thick enough to land right in the middle of these holes, which means when I put it up on the saw, I'm going to put the bolts through from the back, and I'm going to run into the melamine. I can't completely fix that with the thing set up this way, but what I can do is mark where I need to remove melamine for the bolts and washers using a Forstner bit. To extend the marks that I made with the Forstner bit when I had this thing upright, I've got a 5/8 inch cutting bit in the ye-old router. I'm just going to run it along the straight edge, about an inch, 1.25 inches. There's a pencil line on here for where to stop, but it's not critical. With the melamine done, I can turn back to the aluminum and I can take the holes that I used as a template for the melamine drilling and drill them out to 9/64ths, which is the smallest bit that I have that will fully clear the body of the screws. This is super easy drilling. You're taking almost no material off and the existing hole acts as a pilot, but it's still a good job for ye old plug-in guy. Last step is to countersink these holes for the head of the screw. A 5/16 inch countersink is the right tool for this job. I am using a 5/16 inch twist bit, which doesn't really have the right angle on it, but my 1/4 inch bit is too small, so it's this or nothing. Once all the holes are done, countersink ready to go, You have to line everything up pretty much perfectly because once it's in the rails, you don't have a chance to move it around. So get it on a nice flat surface, table saw, bench top, something good. Press down the melamine, press down the aluminum, and get it clamped in place. Then all you got to do is drive some screws. Okay, we're just about ready for the grand unveiling of wing number 1. Just putting these square bolts in the sides so that I have something to slip it into the rail with. Well, that was kind of a pain, but it's just because it's such an exact fit that any racking causes it to bind. So you just kind of gotta, wiggle it, take your time. Okay, there is one in, and I'm pretty happy with it. It's not perfect. So when I build the other one, what am I gonna do differently? Well, 2 things. One, I did not route a wide enough space to get at the nuts that attach this thing to the table. I ended up, even with the room I had in there, holding the nuts with needle nose pliers so that I could tighten them down. The other thing that's not perfect is the alignment of the aluminum and the melamine. The aluminum and the cast iron are spot on, but the melamine is down, I don't know, maybe a 32nd of an inch at most. It's still considerably better than what I had with the stamped wings. So it's not a woe is me situation here. But when I do the quote unquote real one over there on the side with the fence, I am going to work a little bit harder at making sure that the edge of the aluminum and the surface of the melamine are absolutely dead flat. And basically, I think what that means is I'm going to be forced to assemble them on the table saw. I'm pretty sure that this is because that bench is not as flat as I would like it to be. Other than that, construction of the other wing is going to be exactly the same as this one. So let me skip a bit here. Well, as advertised, construction of wing number 2 was almost identical to construction of wing number 1. You didn't really miss anything. The only stuff I did different is I used a piece of paper to shim the aluminum when I lined everything up so I could drill it, just to make absolutely certain that the surface of the melamine was the highest point on the wing. If there's a thickness of a sheet of paper dip just for the width of the aluminum, I don't care. As it turns out, I think it came out pretty smooth. The one other difference with wing number 2, and it's something I'm going to have to go back and change on wing number 1, is I drilled the holes where the wing attaches to the rail 1/2 inch instead of the 3/8 that they were on the old wings. I did that to give myself a little bit more adjustability. This wing is dead flat with the tabletop. The one on this end still droops just a little bit as it heads back into that corner, so I need to make that hole bigger so I can get it up where it's supposed to be. Pretty happy with the results. No binding, no sticking, well, no more than this junk fence ever does. Obviously, if you run your finger back and forth across here, you can feel where the joint is. It's 3 different materials. It goes cast iron, aluminum, melamine. But heck, we're not trying to fool the visually impaired here. We're trying to make a table saw, and for that, I think this is going to work out great. In the process, I've added 50% more table space to the saw. I haven't increased the rip capacity any because I still run out of fence. I'm gonna have to do something about this at one point. But I added a full 4 inches of wing out here to the left, which will give me usable support while I'm ripping material. I added 8 inches of wing over here on the right-hand side of the blade. Why did I add that much wing over here when I'm out of rail and I can't move the fence anymore? Well, I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with the fence, but not necessarily the table saw blade. I now have a nice, big, expansive, laminated wooden surface with a fence up against it. A lot of you probably have already guessed the direction that I'm headed with this, but I'm not going to spoil the surprise now, and it's definitely a project for another day. Till then, thanks for watching. While you're here on the page, think about hitting that subscribe button, and of course, above all else, stay safe, YouTube.